The air changes long before anyone notices. A quiet corridor, a familiar castle, a peaceful night. And then something ancient stirs beneath it all. Good evening, my friends. I am Professor Salamander, and tonight I invite you to walk beside me once more through the hidden corners of the wizarding world. Beyond the glow of wand light and the safety of stone walls, a forgotten shadow is waiting to be found. So settle in, listen closely, and let the mystery unfold. The rain over London fell not in drops, but in a relentless silver curtain that blurred the lines between the Muggle world and the magical one. High above the churning Thames, the gargoyles of the Ministry of Magic dripped with soot-stained water, their stony eyes watching the city sleep. But inside the ministry, deep beneath the pavement where the air smelled of old parchment and ozone, there was no sleep. In the heart of the Auror office, Harry Potter sat at a desk cluttered with moving photographs and half-empty vials of strengthening solution. He was no longer the boy who lived in a cupboard under the stairs. He was a man grown, with shoulders broadened by duty and eyes that had seen too much shadow. Yet, as he stared at a flickering map of the Department of Mysteries, that familiar tightening in his chest, a prickle of intuition, told him that the peace they had fought so hard for was being tested by something cold and very old. The silence of the office was shattered by the frantic chime of a decoy detector. Harry looked up just as Kingsley Shacklebolt, the Minister for Magic himself, strode through the heavy oak doors. Kingsley's usual calm radiance was replaced by a sharp, focused tension. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he dropped a heavy, velvet-lined box onto Harry's desk. It was empty, save for a lingering scent of burnt cedar and a faint, oily residue that seemed to crawl across the fabric like ink in water. Harry leaned forward, his glasses sliding slightly down his nose. He didn't need to ask what was missing. The Department of Mysteries had only one artifact that left a scent like that: the Umbra Virga, the Shadow Wand. It was a relic from the age of the Peverils, a tool not of creation, but of consumption. It didn't cast spells. It ate them. "It happened 20 minutes ago," Kingsley said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the small office. The Unspeakables were conducting a routine resonance test. The containment field didn't just fail, it vanished. No alarms were tripped. No doors were forced. One moment the wand was there, pulsing in its vacuum, and the next, there was only this. He gestured to the oily stain. Harry stood up, reaching for his cloak. He felt a surge of adrenaline that tasted like copper. The Shadow Wand was a legend whispered in the halls of Durmstrang and hidden in the restricted sections of Hogwarts. It was said that the wand was carved from the wood of a tree that grew in total darkness, nourished by the tears of a banshee. In the wrong hands, it wasn't just a weapon, it was a void. It could strip an opponent of their magic, leaving them a squib in a matter of seconds. "Who was on duty?" Harry asked, his voice steady as he strapped his own holly wand to his forearm. Kingsley looked grimmer than Harry had ever seen him. "That's the problem, Harry. Nobody. The logs show the room was empty, but the magical signature left behind. It's scrambled. It's like 1,000 different wizards were in that room at once, or perhaps something that wasn't a wizard at all." Harry walked toward the golden elevators, his boots echoing on the polished dark floor. He thought of Ron and Hermione. Ron was currently home with a sleeping Rose, and Hermione was buried in scrolls at the International Magical Cooperation Office. He decided not to wake them just yet. This felt personal. It felt like a ghost from the war reaching out to grab the present. As the elevator rattled downward toward the Department of Mysteries, Harry felt the temperature drop. The air became thick, pressing against his lungs. When the doors slid open to the 9th level, The black tiled walls seemed to swallow the light from his wand tip. He walked toward the circular room with the many doors. But today, one door stood wide open, vibrating with a dull, rhythmic throb. Inside the chamber of relics, the air was humming. Harry stepped over a pile of shattered glass, the remnants of an hourglass that had been caught in the wake of the theft. He knelt by the pedestal where the shadow wand had sat for centuries. The oily residue was thicker here. He touched it with the tip of his wand, whispering, "Revelio." Usually this would reveal the footsteps of the thief, but instead, the light from his wand was sucked into the stain. The darkness on the floor surged upward, forming a jagged, flickering shape that lasted only a second. It looked like a hand, but with too many fingers, stretching toward the ceiling before dissolving into smoke. Harry's heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't just a theft, it was an invitation. He looked around the room, his aura training kicking in. He ignored the glittering piles of cursed gold and the humming stones of forgotten prophecies, looking instead for the one thing that didn't belong. There, tucked into a crevice behind a bust of Emmerich the Evil, was a small, torn piece of parchment. It wasn't ministry issue. It was rough, yellowed, and smelled of the damp earth of the Scottish Highlands. Harry smoothed it out. There were no words, only a symbol drawn in shaking, hurried ink. A hollow circle with a vertical line through it, partially obscured by a jagged bolt of lightning. It was a mockery of the Deathly Hallows, twisted and broken. "The Forbidden Forest," Harry whispered to the empty room. He knew that ink. It was brewed from the crushed berries of the venomous tentacula that grew only in the deepest, most shadowed gullies near the Hogwarts grounds. Someone wasn't just hiding. They were returning to the site of the greatest battle the wizarding world had ever known. They were going to the place where the veil between life and death had once been thin. Harry turned on his heel, the black tiles of the Department of Mysteries reflecting his determined silhouette. He knew he should wait for backup, but the shadow wand was a hunger that grew the more it traveled. Every second it was out in the world, it was absorbing the ambient magic of the earth. If it reached the ley lines beneath Hogwarts, it could potentially drain the ancient castle of its enchantments, leaving the students defenseless. He emerged from the ministry into the cold London night, the neon signs of the Muggle world flickering in the puddles. With a sharp crack that sounded like a whip cracking in the fog, Harry Potter vanished. He apparated to the edge of Hogsmeade, where the air was even colder and smelled of pine and impending snow. The village was dark, the windows of the 3 broomsticks shuttered against the wind. Above him, the silhouette of Hogwarts Castle rose like a jagged crown against the stormy sky. It looked peaceful, but Harry could feel the discord in the air. The magic of the school was shivering. He began to run, his feet churning the mud of the path that led toward the tree line. The Zapretny Les loomed ahead, a wall of ancient, gnarled oaks and whispering leaves that seemed to lean toward him as he approached. As he reached the perimeter, the silver mane of a centaur flickered between the trees. It was Ronan, his face etched with a cosmic worry. "The stars are hidden tonight, Harry Potter," the centaur said, his voice like wind through dry grass. "The Great Bear bleeds, and the shadows walk without bodies. You seek the Void Maker." Harry slowed to a jog, catching his breath. "It was stolen, Ronan. A wand that eats light. Did you see who brought it here?" Ronan looked deep into the dark heart of the forest, his ears twitching. It was not a man who entered. It was a cold wind dressed in rags. It moved toward the clearing where the spiders no longer weave. Even Aragog's children fear this hunger. Be careful, son of Lily. The wand you seek does not want a master. It wants a feast. Harry thanked him and stepped over the boundary, leaving the path behind. Immediately, the sounds of the night changed. The owls stopped hooting, and the scurrying of forest creatures went silent. The forest was holding its breath. Harry held his wand aloft, the Lumos spell burning bright, but he noticed with a chill that the light only extended a few feet before being abruptly cut off by a wall of unnatural murk. The shadow wand was nearby. He pushed through a thicket of stinging nettles, his eyes scanning the gloom. He found the first sign of the thief's passage, a row of ancient bluebells that had turned to gray ash, their life force sucked dry. Then he saw it. In a clearing ahead, bathed in a sickly, pulsating violet light, stood a figure. It was tall and spindly, wrapped in tattered gray robes that didn't flutter in the wind, but seemed to hang like dead weight. The figure held a long, thin object that looked like a sliver of the night sky held in a hand. "Halt!" Harry shouted, his voice ringing out through the trees. "In the name of the Ministry, drop the artifact!" The figure didn't turn. It didn't flee. It simply raised the shadow wand toward the canopy of the trees. Harry didn't hesitate. "Expelliarmus!" he roared, the familiar jet of red light leaping from his wand. But the red bolt didn't hit the figure. As it drew near, the shadow wand seemed to open like a mouth. The red light twisted, spiraled, and was inhaled by the dark wood. The violet pulse of the wand grew brighter, more violent. The figure finally turned, and Harry's blood ran cold. It wasn't a face that greeted him, but a mask of shifting smoke with 2 pinpricks of white fire for eyes. It wasn't a person at all. It was a construct, a magical golem fueled by the very wand it carried. And now it had tasted Harry's magic. It wanted more. The ground beneath Harry began to tremble as the forest itself started to wither, the stolen power of the wand turning against the world. The chase had ended, but the nightmare was just beginning. The shifting smoke that formed the creature's face roiled with a sudden, predatory hunger, and as the stolen magic of Harry's own disarming charm pulsed within the dark grain of the shadow wand, the very atmosphere of the forbidden forest seemed to curdle into something thick, cold, and profoundly ancient. Harry stood his ground, his boots sinking into the unnaturally blackened soil, while around him the great oaks groaned as if their very sap were being turned to lead by the proximity of the Voidmaker. He realized with a jolt of visceral dread that every spell he cast would not be a weapon against this phantom, but a banquet laid before a starving god. Yet he could not simply stand idle while the creature began to draw the lingering enchantments from the very air of the highlands. The golem raised the sliver of midnight wood once more, and instead of a flash of light, a wave of pure kinetic silence rippled outward, flattening the thickets and snapping the ancient roots of the trees as if they were nothing more than dry kindling in the path of a winter storm. Harry dived to the side, rolling through the ash of the disintegrated bluebells, and felt the freezing rush of the vacuum pass over him, a sensation like being plunged into a glacial lake that threatened to pull the very breath from his lungs and the heat from his skin. He scrambled to his feet behind the gnarled trunk of a silver lime tree, his mind racing through the thousands of hours of Auror training, searching for a solution that did not involve the direct application of magical energy which the wand so clearly craved. The creature moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, not walking so much as sliding through the physical world, its tattered gray robes trailing behind it like the funeral shrouds of 1,000 forgotten kings who had dared to seek the power of the Peverils. It did not speak, for it had no throat to harbor a voice and no soul to command a tongue. Yet the air around it vibrated with a low, dissonant hum that sounded like the distant screaming of many voices caught in a high, whistling wind. Harry watched as a stray spark of light from a nearby colony of glowworms was suddenly pulled toward the wand, the tiny insects falling dead to the mossy floor as their biological luminescence was snuffed out in an instant by the artifact's insatiable gravity. He knew that if he attempted a shield charm, the wand would simply unravel the golden threads of the protection and use that redirected power to crush him against the very earth he sought to protect. The golem turned its head, those pinpricks of white fire scanning the darkness with a mechanical precision that suggested it was not searching for his physical form, but for the brilliant, burning core of his magical signature. As the gaze of the smoke mask fell upon the silver lime tree, Harry felt a sharp, agonizing tug at the center of his chest, as if a hook had been cast into his very essence and was now being reeled in by a fisherman standing on the shores of the afterlife. He realized then that the Shadow Wand wasn't merely a thief of spells, but a harvester of the internal wellspring from which all wizardry flowed, and if he remained within its reach for much longer, his identity would be erased until he was nothing more than a hollow shell, a squib wandering the ruins of his own memories. With a desperate surge of willpower, he forced himself to break cover, not by casting a hex, but by transfiguring the fallen branches at his feet into a swarm of heavy, iron-tipped arrows that were propelled not by magic, but by the mechanical tension of the warped wood. The arrows flew true, hissing through the stagnant air toward the tattered gray robes, but the Shadow Wand reacted with a speed that defied the laws of the physical world, creating a localized distortion in time that slowed the projectiles until they drifted like feathers in a breeze. The creature reached out a misty hand and plucked one of the iron arrows from the air, and as its fingers touched the metal, the iron didn't just break, it decayed, turning into a fine, rust-colored powder that blew away on a wind that existed only within the radius of the wand's influence. Harry's breath hitched in his throat as he realized the sheer scale of the threat. For this was not a duel of skill or a battle of wits, but a confrontation with an entropic force that sought to return the entire magical world to the primordial silence that preceded the first spark of creation. He retreated further into the depths of the forest, the shadows lengthening and twisting into monstrous shapes that seemed to reach for his ankles, while the creature followed with an effortless, gliding stride that mocked his frantic efforts to escape the tightening circle of the void. Far above, the canopy of the forbidden forest began to shiver as the protective enchantments of Hogwarts, miles away, felt the distant pull of the Shadow Wand, and Harry could hear the faint, mournful tolling of a bell from the clock tower, a warning that the castle's ancient heart was starting to bleed its power toward the clearing. He knew he had to lead the creature away from the school, toward the rocky outcroppings where the earth was thick with iron and the natural ley lines were buried deep beneath the granite. Yet every step he took felt like wading through chest-high water that was slowly freezing into solid ice. The golem raised the wand high, and this time it did not wait for Harry to strike. It unleashed a pulse of negative energy that turned the very moonlight into a weapon, casting shadows so sharp and solid that they sliced through the bark of the trees like the blades of a guillotine. Harry threw himself into a shallow ravine, the cold mud caking his robes, and felt a jagged shard of darkness graze his shoulder, leaving behind a numbing sensation that spread through his arm until he could no longer feel the weight of his own holly wand in his hand. He lay there for a moment, the taste of copper and wet earth in his mouth, listening to the rhythmic, thrumming heartbeat of the Shadow Wand as it drew closer, each beat sounding like the closing of a heavy stone door. The silence of the forest was now absolute, a suffocating blanket that pressed against his eardrums, and he realized that the creature had successfully isolated him from the living world, creating a pocket of nothingness where no help could reach him and no light could survive. Yet, even in the depths of his growing exhaustion and the creeping paralysis of the wand's aura, a spark of defiance flickered within him, a memory of a dark forest long ago where he had faced a different kind of death and walked away with the dawn at his back. He reached out with his left hand, searching for something, anything that was not a product of his own magic, and his fingers brushed against the cold, smooth surface of a prehistoric stone, an ancient menhir buried in the silt of the ravine that had stood since before the first wizard had ever carved a wand. As the gray-robed figure appeared at the edge of the ravine, silhouetted against the dying light of the stars, Harry grasped the stone and felt its grounding terrestrial weight, a tether to the physical world that the shadow wand could not so easily consume, because it was not woven of incantations, but of time and pressure. The golem tilted its head, the white fires of its eyes flickering with what might have been a moment of confusion, for it could no longer sense the vibrant, pulsing target of Harry's magic, which he had suppressed by drawing the cold stillness of the ancient rock into his own mind. In that heartbeat of hesitation, Harry did not reach for his wand. He reached for the truth of the forest itself, understanding that to defeat a void, one must not feed it, but must instead surround it with a reality so dense and unyielding that it has nowhere left to expand. He watched as the creature began to descend into the ravine, the shadow wand humming with a frustrated, high-pitched whine that set his teeth on edge. And he knew that the next few seconds would determine whether he would return to the halls of the ministry or become just another ghost lost in the lightless corners of the world's oldest woods. The malevolent construct, draped in its tattered shrouds of ashen gray, hovered at the precipice of the ravine, like a specter born from the fevered dreams of a dying star, its every movement casting a ripple of distortion through the very fabric of the physical world, as the shadow wand continued to emit that harrowing, high-pitched whine. Harry lay perfectly still within the freezing mire of the ditch, his lungs burning with the effort of shallow, rhythmic breathing, while he maintained the mental barrier that suppressed his magical signature, effectively transforming his presence into nothing more than a cold, uninteresting stone among the ruins of the forest floor. The golem's twin white fires of its eyes swept across the muddy slopes with a predatory slowness, and for a terrifying moment, the gaze lingered upon the exact spot where Harry lay concealed, the weight of the Voidmaker's attention feeling like a physical pressure that threatened to crack his ribs and shatter his resolve. He could feel the ancient granite menhir beneath his palm, vibrating in sympathy with the wand's hunger. Yet the stone remained solid and unyielding, a testament to a time when the world was shaped by the slow grinding of glaciers rather than the flick of a willow branch and the murmur of an incantation. As the creature descended into the hollow, its feet never truly touching the mud, but instead compressing the air into pockets of absolute zero, the temperature plummeted so drastically that the moisture on Harry's eyelashes turned to fine needles of frost that stung with every blink. He realized that the creature was not merely searching for him, but was actively terraforming the clearing into a dead zone where the laws of life were being systematically rewritten into the laws of the grave. For as the shadow wand passed over a cluster of dormant ferns, they did not just wither, but disintegrated into a fine, translucent mist that smelled of ancient dust and forgotten sorrows. Harry's fingers began to go numb, despite his desperate grip on the grounding stone, and he knew that if he did not act before the creature reached the center of the ravine, the ambient magic within his own blood, the very heritage of his wizarding lineage, would be forcibly extracted through his pores like steam from a kettle. With a sudden, explosive burst of physical energy that owed nothing to the wand strapped to his arm, Harry lunged forward from the muck, using the heavy menhir as a makeshift shield between himself and the direct line of sight of the smoke-masked golem. The shadow wand reacted instantly to the sudden motion, unleashing a jagged bolt of negative light that was not white or red, but a harrowing shade of ultraviolet that seemed to pull the color out of the surrounding trees and turn the world into a flickering, monochromatic nightmare. The bolt struck the ancient stone in Harry's hand with the force of a falling mountain, and though the granite cracked under the supernatural strain, it did not vanish, for its density was a physical reality that the wand's metaphysical hunger struggled to digest in a single, gluttonous gulp. Taking advantage of the momentary recoil as the artifact wrestled with the stubborn materiality of the rock, Harry didn't reach for a curse or a hex, but instead plunged his hand into the satchel at his side to retrieve a handful of Peruvian instant darkness powder, a substance he had carried since the days of the war. He flung the powder into the air, and instead of creating a simple cloud of soot, the magical grains reacted violently with the aura of the shadow wand, creating a feedback loop of absolute, impenetrable blackness that even the creature's fiery eyes could not pierce. In the confusion of the artificial midnight, Harry moved with the silent, desperate grace of a hunted stag, circling around the creature while the sound of the wand's whine ascended to a frequency that made his ears bleed, the liquid warmth of his own blood trickling down his neck and freezing against his collar. He could hear the golem thrashing within the cloud of darkness, its tattered robes whipping through the air like the wings of a giant bat, while the shadow wand lashed out blindly, sending pulses of energy that carved deep, smoking furrows into the earth and sent sprays of boiling mud high into the canopy. Harry knew that he could not maintain this deception for long, for the powder was being rapidly consumed by the wand's insatiable appetite, each grain of darkness serving as a tiny morsel that only increased the artifact's power and heightened the creature's frantic search for the source of the interference. He found himself standing near a massive, lightning-struck oak that had survived the centuries by weaving its roots deep into the bedrock of the highlands, and he realized that the only way to neutralize a weapon that ate magic was to provide it with a source so vast and so uncontrollable that the vessel containing it would inevitably shatter under the pressure of the intake. High above, the clouds finally parted to reveal a moon that was bloated and pale, casting a ghostly light upon the ruins of the ravine just as the last of the darkness powder was inhaled by the pulsating sliver of cedar in the golem's hand. The creature stood perfectly still, its smoke mask turning toward Harry with a terrifying mechanical snap, and the two pinpricks of white fire flared with a renewed, malevolent intelligence, as if the wand itself had finally calculated the trajectory of Harry's soul. Harry raised his holly wand, not to point it at the enemy, but to point it directly at the heart of the lightning-struck oak, whispering a complex, ancient transfiguration that he had studied in the restricted archives of the ministry, a spell designed to awaken the dormant, primal spirit of the wood and the earth. As the green light of his spell hit the bark, the tree didn't just transform, it screamed, a sound of grinding wood and shifting tectonic plates that drowned out the wand's whine, and the massive roots began to heave upward like the limbs of a waking giant, churning the soil into a maelstrom of debris. The shadow wand turned its terrible focus toward the awakened tree, and for the first time, the golem seemed to stagger under the sheer volume of the magical energy that began to pour from the ancient oak. For the tree was a conduit for the ley lines of the entire valley, a fountain of raw, terrestrial power that had been building for 1,000 years. The artifact began to glow with a blinding, terrifying radiance as it attempted to swallow the mountain of magic that Harry had unleashed, its dark wood swelling and hissing as if it were being dipped into molten gold, while the golem's form began to flicker and blur, the smoke of its body becoming thin and transparent under the strain of maintaining the connection. Harry watched with wide, stinging eyes as the clearing became a theater of impossible forces, the air itself catching fire from the friction of the competing magics. And he realized that he was witnessing the limits of the Peveril's craftsmanship being tested against the primordial strength of the earth itself. The ground beneath his feet began to liquefy, turning into a slurry of molten glass and ash, and he had to scramble up the side of the ravine to avoid being swallowed by the very chaos he had orchestrated to save his life. The golem let out a sound that was not a scream, but a hollow, metallic roar, its misty hands clenching the shadow wand so tightly that the wood began to splinter and weep a dark, viscous fluid that looked like the blood of the night sky. The violet light of the wand was now fighting against a golden, earthen fire that erupted from the tree's roots, and the two forces collided in a spectacular, silent explosion of energy that sent a shockwave rippling through the forest, knocking Harry backward into the undergrowth and stripping the leaves from every branch for a mile in every direction. As he tumbled through the air, he saw the golem's form finally begin to unravel, the tattered gray robes dissolving into threads of smoke that were swept away by the magical gale, leaving only the shadow wand suspended in the air, vibrating with such intensity that it seemed to exist in 3 places at once. The conflict was no longer between a wizard and a thief, but between a fragment of the void and the fullness of the world. And Harry knew that when the final collapse occurred, the resulting vacuum would either seal the breach or pull the entire forbidden forest into the abyss along with it. The atmospheric pressure within the ravine reached a point of excruciating density, where the very oxygen seemed to have been replaced by a static, electrified hum that vibrated through the marrow of Harry's bones and threatened to shatter the glass of his spectacles. He watched, breathless and battered, as the shadow wand, now shorn of its smoke-masked puppeteer, hung suspended in a vortex of its own making, a sliver of impossible darkness that fought to consume the torrent of terrestrial gold pouring from the heart of the ancient, lightning-struck oak. The ground beneath the tree had become a churning cauldron of molten soil and translucent roots, and as the two forces clashed, the air was filled with the scent of ozone, wet earth, and something much older, something that smelled of the very first dawn of the world before man had learned to name the stars. Harry pulled himself upright against a jagged shelf of granite, his fingers bleeding from the climb, and his breath coming in ragged, freezing gasps that blossomed like white ghosts in the supernatural chill that still clung to the hollow. He realized with a jolt of clarity that the wand was not merely absorbing the tree's power, but was attempting to invert it, to turn the life-giving essence of the Highlands into a weapon of absolute negation that would sweep across the grounds of Hogwarts like a tidal wave of shadow. The wand's physical form began to pulse with a rhythmic, sickening light, expanding and contracting like a dying heart, while the splintering wood groaned under the weight of the stolen magic that it was never truly meant to contain for so long, without a living master to anchor it. Harry knew that the equilibrium was failing, for the golden fire of the oak was being slowly strangled by the encroaching violet rot. And if the wand succeeded in fully digesting the tree's spirit, it would become an unstoppable engine of destruction that no shield or counter-curse in the Ministry's archives could ever hope to repel. He reached for his holly wand, but his arm felt as heavy as lead, the numbing touch of the shadow strike from earlier having migrated into his shoulder and turned his nerves into icy wires that refused to carry the commands of his brain. In that moment of encroaching despair, he remembered the words of Albus Dumbledore regarding the nature of ancient artifacts. That they often possessed a pride as deep as their power, and that to break a thing that thinks itself a god, one must remind it of its own fragile material beginnings. With a roar of defiance that was swallowed by the howling magical gale, Harry launched himself down the slope of the ravine once more, ignoring the searing heat of the molten glass and the jagged shards of darkness that sliced through his robes like the talons of an invisible beast. He did not aim for the wand with a spell, for he knew that any further magic would only serve as fuel for the catastrophe. But instead he reached for the heavy, cracked menhir he had used as a shield, which now lay glowing with a dull, subterranean heat in the mud. He hoisted the stone with a strength born of pure adrenaline-fueled desperation, feeling the rough surface bite into his palms as he staggered toward the center of the vortex, where the shadow wand was screaming its silent, high-pitched song of hunger. The closer he drew to the artifact, the more the world seemed to warp and bend, the trees behind him appearing miles away, while the wand ahead loomed like a black tower that touched the very vault of the heavens. Just as the wand prepared to unleash a final, crushing pulse of negative energy that would have leveled the forest to its very roots, Harry slammed the ancient granite menhir into the localized distortion of the vacuum, using the physical mass of the rock to disrupt the delicate flow of the magical intake. The impact was not a sound, but a metaphysical shockwave that turned the air into a solid wall of white light. And for a heartbeat, time itself seemed to stutter and reverse, the falling leaves floating upward and the spilled blood of the forest retreating into the moss. The shadow wand, caught between the unyielding reality of the stone and the overwhelming pressure of the oak's gold, finally reached its breaking point. A hairline fracture appeared along its midnight-colored length, and from that tiny wound, a fountain of stolen light erupted with the force of a supernova. Harry was thrown backward by the sheer kinetic force of the release, his body tumbling through the air like a rag doll as the ravine was filled with a roar that sounded like the collapse of 1,000 cathedrals. He landed hard against the far bank, the air driven from his lungs and his vision swimming with brilliant, dancing spots of purple and gold. But through the haze of his exhaustion, he saw the most remarkable sight he had ever beheld in his years of magical service. The shadow wand had not merely broken, it had dissolved, its essence shattered into 10,000 tiny sparks of violet flame that drifted through the air like fireflies, each one carrying back a fragment of the magic it had stolen from the forest and the world. The ancient oak, though scarred and blackened, began to glow with a soft, healing radiance, its leaves unfurling in the middle of the winter night, as if the warmth of 100 summers had been returned to its branches in a single, magnificent instant. The oily residue that had plagued the Department of Mysteries evaporated into a sweet-smelling mist, and the oppressive silence of the void was replaced by the sudden, triumphant chorus of the forest's nocturnal creatures, their voices rising in a hymn of survival. Harry lay in the cooling mud for a long time, watching the sparks of magic return to the earth, feeling the warmth slowly return to his frozen limbs as the unnatural chill of the shadow wand's presence faded into the memory of the wind. He knew that the danger had passed, for the artifact's physical anchor had been destroyed by its own gluttony and the stubborn, unmoving reality of the world it had tried to erase. Yet he also knew that the mystery of who had unleashed such a horror remained a shadow on the horizon. The construct of smoke and rags had been a mere shadow, a vessel for a greater ambition that still lurked within the halls of the ministry, or perhaps in the dark corners of the world, where the old families still dreamed of the Peveril's lost treasures. He sat up, wiping the soot and blood from his brow, and saw his holly wand lying a few feet away, its wood humming with a sympathetic resonance, as if it were congratulating him on a victory won not through the power of his magic, but through the strength of his humanity. The moon, now clear and bright in the sky, illuminated the ruins of the ravine, showing the deep furrows and the patches of glass where the conflict had been most intense, a permanent scar on the face of the forbidden forest that would serve as a warning for generations to come. Harry stood up on trembling legs, his body aching with 1,000 bruises, and his mind already turning toward the report he would have to give to Kingsley. Yet there was a peace in his heart that he had not felt since the end of the war. He had looked into the void and had not blinked, and in doing so, he had reminded the shadows that the light of the world wasn't something that could be easily consumed or forgotten by the likes of a hollow wand. He began the long walk back toward the castle, the silhouette of Hogwarts rising ahead like a beacon of hope against the fading stars, while behind him, the forest whispered its gratitude in a language of rustling leaves and shifting shadows that only a hero could truly understand. The silver light of the moon, now unshackled from the suffocating shroud of the Shadow Wand's influence, washed over the ravaged clearing with a gentle, redeeming brilliance that seemed to scrub the very air of its lingering malignancy and restore the natural rhythm of the forbidden forest. Harry Potter, his robes tattered and his skin etched with the soot of a battle that had defied the conventional laws of wizardry, stood amidst the cooling glass and splintered timber while the last violet embers of the destroyed artifact drifted upward like dying stars toward the canopy. He felt the heavy, thrumming resonance of the ancient oak beginning to subside into a peaceful slumber, the golden fire that had saved his life receding back into the deep ley lines of the Scottish Highlands. Yet the silence that followed was not the hollow vacuum of the void, but the fertile, breathing quiet of a living wood. His hand, still trembling from the monumental effort of hoisting the granite menhir, closed around the familiar warmth of his holly wand, and he felt a surge of grounding magic flow through his veins, mending the frayed edges of his nerves and pushing back the numbing cold that had threatened to claim his spirit. As he began to navigate the treacherous terrain of the ravine, stepping over the frozen waves of mud and the calcified remains of the golem's gray shrouds, he noticed a faint, rhythmic pulsing emanating from the spot where the Shadow Wand had finally shattered into oblivion. It was not the predatory hunger of the relic itself, but a residual echo, a lingering frequency that suggested the wand had been tethered to a secondary source of power far beyond the boundaries of the Hogwarts grounds. Harry knelt by a patch of scorched moss, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a small, metallic object that had survived the cataclysmic release of energy. A heavy silver signet ring, its surface blackened by the magical fire, but still bearing the unmistakable crest of a family thought to have perished in the fires of the Great War. The crest, a coiled manticore clutching a broken hourglass, belonged to the House of Vane, a lineage of pure-blood sorcerers who had once served as the keepers of the Department of Mysteries long before the Ministry of Magic had even been conceived in its modern form. The realization that the theft was an inside job, orchestrated by someone with ancestral knowledge of the department's most forbidden vaults, sent a new kind of chill through Harry's chest, one that no warming charm could ever hope to fully dispel. He carefully levitated the ring into a silk handkerchief, sensing the faint, oily traces of the same magic that had animated the smoke-masked construct, and he understood that the person who had sent the golem into the forest was likely watching the aftermath through a scrying glass from the safety of a high-walled manor or a hidden office within the ministry itself. The battle in the forest had been a test, a calibration of the Shadow Wand's capabilities against the most famous wizard of the age, and though the artifact was destroyed, the data gathered by its master would be invaluable for whatever darker purpose they truly envisioned for the future of the wizarding world. Harry looked back at the lightning-struck oak, seeing the deep scars in its bark where the violet rot had tried to take hold, and he vowed that the peace he had bled for would not be traded for the ambitions of a ghost seeking to reclaim a lost legacy. The walk back toward the castle felt longer than the journey into the woods, every muscle in his body protesting the movement, while the distant towers of Hogwarts shimmered like a mirage against the pre-dawn sky, their windows flickering with the first light of early rising students and weary professors. He bypassed the main gates, opting instead for a narrow, overgrown path that led toward the Hagrid's hut, where the familiar smell of wood smoke and the low, rumbling snores of Fang offered a momentary sanctuary from the high-stakes intrigue of the Ministry. As he crested the final hill, he saw a lone figure standing by the edge of the Black Lake, the hem of a great, midnight blue cloak fluttering in the wind that whipped across the water's surface in restless patterns. It was Hermione Granger, her hair a wild halo of curls, and her expression one of such intense calculation and worry that Harry knew she had sensed the magical shockwave from her office in London and had likely broken half a dozen international transport laws to reach him before the sun had even touched the horizon. "Harry," she breathed, her voice a mixture of profound relief and sharp, analytical sternness as she hurried toward him, her wand already performing a dozen diagnostic charms that swirled around his head like golden dragonflies. The sensors in the Department of Mysteries went completely silent 10 minutes ago, and the headmistress reported a surge in the forest's ley lines that was visible as far away as Hogsmeade. What on earth happened out there? And why do you smell like burnt cedar and prehistoric stone? Harry reached out to steady her, his own exhaustion finally catching up to him as the adrenaline ebbed away, leaving him feeling as fragile as a piece of ancient parchment that had been left out in the rain for too long. He held out the silk handkerchief containing the Vane signet ring, and as Hermione's eyes fell upon the blackened crest, the color drained from her face, her brilliant mind already connecting the dots between the missing artifacts, the corrupted wards, and the shadows that were beginning to lengthen within the very heart of their government. "It wasn't just a theft, Hermione," Harry said, his voice a low rasp that seemed to carry the weight of the forest's ancient sorrow. "It was an assassination attempt on the magical balance of Britain, and whoever sent that thing into the woods didn't care if they burned the whole school down just to see if the shadow wand could swallow the boy who lived." They stood together in the fading darkness, two veterans of a war that had never truly ended, watching as the first pale sliver of the sun began to peek over the jagged peaks of the mountains, turning the surface of the Black Lake into a sheet of beaten copper. The mystery of the shadow wand was far from over, for the destruction of the physical tool was merely the first move in a grander, more perilous game of chess that would require them to descend once more into the labyrinthine secrets of the past. As they turned to walk toward the castle, the wind carried a faint, mocking whisper through the grass, a sound that might have been the rustling of leaves, or might have been the laughter of a man who knew that even a broken wand could cast a very long shadow. The golden light of the dawn began to creep over the jagged peaks of the Scottish Highlands, casting long, spindly shadows across the dew-slicked grass of the Hogwarts grounds as Harry and Hermione climbed the stone steps toward the Great Hall, their footsteps echoing with a heavy, rhythmic finality against the ancient masonry that had stood for 1,000 years. Inside the castle, the air was thick with the scent of toasted bread and floor wax, a comforting, mundane contrast to the smell of ozone and ancient decay that still clung to Harry's singed robes and the singed edges of his hair. They did not head toward the Gryffindor table or the warmth of the fireside, but instead veered toward the spiral staircase that led to the headmistress's office, for the weight of the Vane signet ring in Harry's pocket felt as though it were burning through the fabric of his trousers, a physical reminder of a conspiracy that reached into the very roots of the British wizarding world. Hermione's brow was furrowed in that characteristic expression of intense, scholarly concentration, her fingers twitching at her side as if she were already flipping through the invisible pages of 1,000 genealogical records and ministry personnel files to find the link between the Shadow Wand and the disgraced House of Vane. As they reached the stone gargoyle that guarded the entrance to the inner sanctum, the creature leaped aside without a password, sensing the urgency in Harry's stride and the crackling remnants of the forest's primal magic that still radiated from his skin like heat from a dying forge. They ascended the moving stairs in silence, the portraits of past headmasters watching them with painted eyes that seemed to reflect a mixture of pity and recognition. For they had seen many such weary heroes return from the darkness with burdens too heavy for their young shoulders to bear. Upon entering the circular room, they found Professor McGonagall standing by the tall window, her tartan shawl wrapped tightly around her thin frame, and her gaze fixed upon the Zapretny Less, where a faint plume of silver mist still hovered over the site of the night's devastation. She turned as they approached, her lips thinned into a line of grim determination, and before Harry could utter a single word of explanation, she raised a hand to forestall him, her eyes falling immediately upon the scorched silk handkerchief he held in his trembling palm. The castle felt it, Harry. The stones themselves shivered as if an icy hand had been laid upon the heart of the school, and the centaurs have been crying out to the stars since the stroke of midnight, she said, her voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the authority of the mountains themselves. Harry placed the Vane signet on the mahogany desk, and as the silver crest caught the morning light, the room seemed to grow momentarily colder, the various silver instruments on the surrounding shelves spinning and puffing with a frantic, erratic energy. McGonagall leaned forward, her spectacles glinting, and a sharp intake of breath escaped her as she recognized the broken hourglass of the Vane family, a house that had officially been declared extinct after the fall of Voldemort, but whose secrets had apparently been preserved in the lightless vaults of the Department of Mysteries. This is a shadow of a past we thought we had burned to ash, for the Vanes were never merely supporters of the Dark Lord. They were architects of a much older, much more nihilistic philosophy that viewed magic not as a gift to be wielded, but as a resource to be hoarded and stripped from those they deemed unworthy. Hermione stepped forward, her voice sharp with the realization that had been simmering in her mind since they had stood by the lake, and she began to weave a narrative of political maneuverings and hidden agendas that made the hairs on the back of Harry's neck stand up in alarm. If someone from the House of Vane survived, or if their ideology has taken root in a new generation of ministry officials, then the theft of the Shadow Wand was not an isolated act of madness, but the first stage of a systematic dismantling of our current magical infrastructure, she explained, her hands gesturing toward the map of Britain that hung on the wall. She pointed to the ley lines that converged beneath the ministry in London and the school in Scotland, suggesting that the golem Harry had fought was merely a probe, a way to test if the ancient defenses could be bypassed by a weapon that consumed the very energy intended to repel it. Harry listened as the two women spoke, his mind drifting back to the sensation of the wand's hunger, that terrible, hollow pulling at the center of his being that had felt like his very soul was being unspooled into the dark. He realized then that the conflict was no longer a matter of chasing a thief through the woods, but was instead a war of attrition against a phantom that could be hiding in any office in the ministry, perhaps even behind the desk of someone he had called a colleague or a friend for the past 3 years. We need to go back to London, to the Department of Mysteries, and find out who had access to the resonance testing logs, because the golem I fought didn't just stumble upon the wand. "It was summoned into that room by someone who knew exactly how to silence the alarms," Harry said, his voice gaining a hard, flinty edge that reminded McGonagall of the young man who had once stood before the gates of the school to face a literal god of death. He knew that the peace they had enjoyed was a fragile thing, a thin layer of gold leaf covering a world of deep, jagged fissures, and that he would have to become the hunter once more if he wanted to ensure that the students currently sleeping in the dormitories above them would never have to know the touch of the shadow wand. The headmistress nodded, her expression softening for a fleeting moment as she looked at the two of them, the boy who had lived and the brightest witch of her age, and she realized that the burden of the world was once again shifting onto their weary backs. "I shall contact Kingsley Shacklebolt immediately, but you must be cautious, for the Ministry is a labyrinth of 1,000 mirrors, and the person who holds the strings of the Vane legacy may be the very one who greets you at the golden elevators," she warned, her hand resting briefly on Harry's shoulder in a gesture of silent support. As Harry and Hermione turned to leave the office, the sun finally broke fully over the horizon, flooding the room with a brilliant, blinding light that chased the shadows into the corners, but could not quite erase the cold, metallic weight of the signet ring that still sat upon the desk. They descended the stairs, their minds already racing toward the city and the dark halls of the government, knowing that the journey ahead would lead them into a web of deceit, where every spell cast and every word spoken could be a trap, set by an enemy who had spent centuries learning how to hide in the light. The walk through the castle toward the apparition point outside the gates was accompanied by the sounds of the school waking up. The clatter of plates in the great hall, the chatter of students discussing their weekend plans, and the distant, melodic whistling of a house elf cleaning the corridors, all of which felt like a beautiful, fragile dream that Harry was determined to protect at any cost. He looked at Hermione, seeing the same resolve mirrored in her brown eyes, and he knew that as long as they stood together, the shadows of the past would find no purchase in the world they had built from the ruins of the war. With a final look back at the towers of Hogwarts, which stood proud and unyielding against the morning sky, the two of them stepped beyond the boundary of the wards, and, with a simultaneous crack that sounded like the closing of a great book, disappeared from the Highlands to face the gathering storm in the heart of London. The arrival in London was a jarring transition from the ethereal, mist-laden silence of the Scottish Highlands to the cacophonous, soot-choked reality of the Muggle capital, where the relentless rhythm of the morning commute created a chaotic tapestry of gray coats and rushing umbrellas that ignored the two wizards appearing within the shadows of a recessed alleyway near Whitehall. Harry and Hermione did not linger to observe the mundane world, but instead adjusted their cloaks and moved with a synchronized, purposeful haste toward the red telephone box that served as the primary visitor's entrance to the Ministry of Magic, their expressions mirrored in the polished glass of the surrounding buildings like the faces of weary sentinels returning from a distant and forgotten frontier. As they stepped into the cramped interior of the booth, and Harry dialed the familiar sequence of numbers, the floor began its smooth, mechanical descent, pulling them away from the roar of the city and plunging them once more into the subterranean chill of the magical government, where the air was thick with the scent of old parchment and the low administrative hum of 1,000 busy quills. The golden elevators rattled and groaned as they plummeted toward the atrium, and when the grills finally slid open with a sharp, metallic clang, Harry felt a sudden, inexplicable tightening in his chest, as if the very walls of the ministry were leaning inward to overhear the secrets he carried beneath his heavy traveling cloak. The vast hall, dominated by the fountain of magical brethren, which cast flickering, watery reflections against the dark, tiled floor, was unusually quiet for such a pivotal hour, with only a few straggling clerks and a solitary security wizard standing by the golden gates, his eyes darting toward Harry's scar with a mixture of reverence and a newly sharpened, suspicious curiosity. They bypassed the main reception desk, Harry's boots echoing with a hollow, rhythmic thud that seemed to announce their presence to every hidden alcove and whispering portrait in the building, and headed directly for the lift that would take them to the 9th level, the Department of Mysteries, where the silence was not merely an absence of sound, but a physical weight that pressed against their eardrums like the depths of the ocean. When the lift finally reached the lowest level, and the voice announced their arrival with a cool, disembodied indifference, the doors opened upon a corridor that seemed to stretch into infinity, the black tiles polished to such a high sheen that they looked like a dark, frozen lake, reflecting the flickering torchlight of a world that had forgotten the sun. Hermione gripped her wand tightly, her knuckles white against the dark wood, and she leaned closer to Harry as they approached the circular room with the many doors, her voice a barely audible breath that was nonetheless amplified by the unnatural acoustics of the stone. "The security wards on this level have been modified since we were here last, Harry, for I can feel a secondary layer of enchantment that is not ministry issue. It's a selective filter, one that is designed to let through the traces of vain magic while flagging any foreign signature that doesn't match the ancestral resonance of the original keepers." They reached the door that led to the Chamber of Relics, the site of the original theft, and found it guarded not by a wizard or a stone gargoyle, but by a shimmering curtain of silver light that vibrated with the same dissonant, high-pitched frequency that Harry had heard in the Forbidden Forest during his confrontation with the Shadow Wand. As he reached out to touch the barrier with the tip of his holly wand, the silver light flared into a brilliant, blinding violet, and a voice that seemed to come from the very stones of the floor spoke a single, ancient word in a language that predated the arrival of the Romans in Britain. The barrier did not drop, but instead transformed into a doorway shaped like an hourglass, within which the sands were flowing upward in defiance of gravity, a clear sign that the magic governing this space had been inverted by someone with an intimate understanding of the department's most esoteric and dangerous secrets. "We are expected," Harry whispered, his eyes narrowing as he stepped through the hourglass portal and found himself standing in a room that was no longer a simple vault, but had been transformed into a ritual chamber draped in banners of emerald and silver, the colors of a house that had supposedly been erased from history. At the center of the room, standing by the empty pedestal where the Shadow Wand had once rested, was a man whose presence seemed to draw the very light from the torches. His tall, gaunt frame silhouetted against a mural of the constellations that moved across the ceiling in a slow, mournful dance. He turned to face them, and Harry felt a jolt of recognition that was like a physical blow to the stomach. For the man's face was a younger, sharper version of the one he had seen on the Vain Signet ring, his eyes burning with a fanatical, cold intelligence that spoke of decades spent in the dark, waiting for the world to forget the crimes of his ancestors. Mr. Potter and the incomparable Mrs. Granger Weasley, how kind of you to return the family heirloom so promptly, although I must admit that I am disappointed that you found it necessary to destroy the wand before we could complete the final calibration of the ley line integration, the man said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that carried no trace of malice, only a terrifying academic detachment. He held out a hand, and the Vain Signet ring that Harry had been carrying in his pocket flew across the room of its own accord, snapping onto his finger with a sharp, metallic click that sounded like the locking of a cage door. This was Cassius Vane, a man who had officially died in a laboratory accident in the late 70s, but who had clearly spent the intervening years hiding within the very department he had once sought to master, weaving himself into the bureaucracy like a parasite that had become indistinguishable from its host. "You stole the wand to strip the magic from the forest, to see if you could hollow out the ancient places of the world and use that power to rewrite the Ministry's laws in your own image," Hermione stated, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a righteous, boiling anger that seemed to fill the room with a sudden golden heat. Cassius smiled, a thin, mirthless expression that did not reach his pale eyes, and he gestured toward the empty pedestal as if it were an altar upon which he had sacrificed the peace of the entire wizarding community just to prove a point about the superiority of his lineage. The wand was a tool, a means of measuring the resistance of the old world to the new order I am destined to bring. For the war you fought was merely a squabble between children compared to the total reconfiguration of reality that the Vane legacy demands," he explained, his fingers tracing the air where the shadow wand had once hovered. Harry raised his wand, the tip glowing with a fierce, unwavering light that reflected the determination in his soul. But as he prepared to cast a binding curse, the floor beneath their feet began to shift and rotate, the circular room coming alive as the doors began to spin with a dizzying, kaleidoscopic speed. The conflict had moved beyond the physical realm of the forest and had entered the psychological labyrinth of the Department of Mysteries, where the laws of space and time were as malleable as clay in the hands of a master potter. They were no longer just facing a man, but were confronting the collective memory of a house that believed it owned the very essence of magic itself. And as the walls of the chamber began to dissolve into a series of interconnected memories and illusions, Harry knew that the true battle for the future of their world was only just beginning. The shadows were no longer outside in the woods. They were here, in the heart of the Ministry, and they were hungry for the light that Harry and Hermione had spent their entire lives trying to protect from the coming of the night. The circular chamber, once a static vault of cold stone and silent secrets, now became a whirling vortex of architectural impossibility as Cassius Vane gestured with his ringed hand, causing the very doors of the Department of Mysteries to spin with such a dizzying, kaleidoscopic velocity that the boundaries between the rooms began to bleed into one another like wet ink on a fresh scroll. Harry planted his feet firmly upon the shifting floor, feeling the familiar, grounding weight of his holly wand pulsing in his palm as he reached out with his free hand to catch Hermione's arm, for the gravity of the room had suddenly become a fickle and treacherous thing that threatened to pull them toward the dark, hungry mouth of the veil that shimmered in the distance. Cassius stood at the eye of this artificial storm, his gaunt silhouette unmoved by the centrifugal force that sent loose parchments and shattered glass spiraling through the air like the wings of panicked birds, and his laughter, thin and dry as the rustling of dead leaves, seemed to emanate not from his throat, but from the very shadows that clung to the corners of the ceiling. You believe that by destroying the physical vessel of the Shadow Wand, you have severed the connection to the void. Yet you fail to understand that the artifact was merely a tuning fork designed to resonate with the dormant potential of the Vane lineage, he proclaimed, his voice cutting through the roar of the spinning room with a terrifying, melodic clarity that made the silver instruments on the shelves explode into fragments of shimmering dust. Hermione, her eyes wide with a mixture of academic horror and fierce, tactical brilliance, raised her own wand to weave a complex web of shield charms around them, the golden threads of her magic struggling to hold their shape against the corrosive, violet pressure that Cassius was exerting upon the atmosphere. She shouted a counter-incantation in a dialect of Old Latin that Harry only vaguely recognized from his days in the library, and for a heartbeat, the spinning of the doors slowed, revealing glimpses of the brain room with its glowing green tanks and the Hall of Prophecy, where the ghosts of 1,000 shattered futures still whispered in the dark. However, the respite was fleeting, for Cassius merely turned the signet ring upon his finger, and the floor beneath Harry's boots dissolved into a pool of liquid shadow, plunging him into a sensory deprivation so absolute that for a terrifying moment he felt as though his very body had been erased from the tapestry of existence. He drifted in a world of absolute nothingness, where the concepts of up and down had no meaning, and the only sound was the rhythmic, booming thud of his own heart, which sounded like the drums of an approaching army echoing through a hollow mountain. He realized then that Cassius was not trying to kill him with a simple curse, but was instead attempting to hollow out his mind, to replace the vibrant, messy reality of his memories with the cold, sterile perfection of the vain philosophy, which viewed the individual as nothing more than a temporary vessel for the preservation of pure, unadulterated power. With a desperate, silent roar of defiance, Harry reached deep within himself, searching for the core of his own magic. Not the polished, disciplined spells of an auror, but the raw, instinctive light that had once repelled the Dementors in the forest and had faced the killing curse without flinching in the graveyard of Little Hangleton. He visualized the faces of those he loved, the warmth of the burrow during a winter feast, the laughter of Ron over a game of wizard's chess, and the steady, unwavering presence of Hermione at his side. And as these images solidified in his mind, the darkness began to crack and splinter like ice under the heat of a summer sun. A brilliant, silver light erupted from his chest, taking the form of a stag that charged through the void with its antlers lowered, and as the Patronus struck the boundary of the Shadow Realm, the illusion shattered with a sound like 1,000 mirrors breaking simultaneously, returning Harry to the cold, hard floor of the Department of Mysteries. He gasped for air, his lungs burning as if he had been underwater for an eternity, and saw that Hermione had managed to anchor herself to a heavy stone pedestal, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a fierce, protective light as she continued to duel Cassius with a flurry of non-verbal hexes that lit up the room like a display of magical fireworks. Cassius was no longer the composed aristocrat he had been a moment ago. His hair was disheveled, and his skin had taken on a translucent grayish hue as the effort of maintaining the dimensional distortion began to drain the very life force from his aging frame. He lashed out with a whip of violet flame that carved a deep, smoking furrow into the black tiles, but Harry was already moving, his reflexes honed by years of Quidditch and combat as he dived through the arc of the fire and leveled his wand at the glowing signet ring that served as the focus for Cassius's stolen power. Expelliarmus! Harry roared, the spell leaving his wand with such force that it carried with it the accumulated weight of his exhaustion and his fury, and though Cassius tried to deflect the bolt with a flick of his wrist, the red light struck the silver ring with the precision of a master duelist's strike. The ring didn't just fly from his finger, it exploded into a cloud of metallic shards that embedded themselves into the surrounding walls, and as the connection to the vain ancestral magic was severed, the spinning doors ground to a violent, screeching halt that threw everyone to the floor. The magical pressure that had been suffocating the room vanished in an instant, replaced by a sudden heavy stillness that felt like the silence after a great cathedral bell has finished tolling, and the flickering violet light of the Shadow Wand's echo died out, leaving only the pale, flickering glow of the Ministry's standard torches. Cassius Vane lay slumped against the central pedestal, his hands clawing at the stone as if he were trying to pull the earth itself around him for warmth. And as the masks of his ambition and his heritage fell away, he looked like nothing more than a frail, broken old man who had spent too many years living in the company of ghosts and shadows. Harry approached him, his wand still drawn, but his heart heavy with a profound sense of pity for a man who had chosen to be the king of a graveyard rather than a citizen of a living world. While Hermione hurried to his side, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps as she checked him for injuries with a series of frantic, silent charms. The doors of the circular room were now frozen in place, some hanging half open to reveal the mundane, dusty interiors of the storage vaults, and for the first time since they had entered the Department of Mysteries, the air smelled of nothing more than old stone and the cooling residue of spent magic. "It's over, Cassius," Harry said, his voice quiet but echoing through the ruins of the chamber with a finality that could not be ignored. "The legacy you tried to build was founded on a void, and like all voids, it has finally collapsed under its own weight, leaving you with nothing but the silence of the ancestors you tried so hard to please." The man did not answer, his eyes fixed on the empty air where the shadow wand had once hovered, and though he was still breathing, it was clear that the brilliance of his intellect had been snuffed out by the very darkness he had sought to command, leaving him a hollow shell in the heart of the government he had tried to subvert. As the heavy footsteps of the Ministry's reinforcement teams began to echo down the corridor, led by the unmistakable deep voice of Kingsley Shacklebolt, Harry and Hermione shared a look of weary, silent understanding, knowing that while this particular shadow had been banished, the light they guarded would always require their vigilance in a world where the past was never truly dead, but only waiting for the next ambitious hand to reach for a broken wand. The heavy, rhythmic thud of Auror boots began to reverberate through the obsidian corridors of the Department of Mysteries, sounding like the approach of a distant thunderstorm that threatened to break the unnatural, ringing silence that had settled over the shattered ritual chamber where Cassius Vane now slumped as a mere husk of his former ambition. Harry stood over the fallen man, his breath coming in ragged, steaming plumes that caught the flickering torchlight, while his holly wand remained leveled with a steady, unyielding precision at the heart of the shadow traitor, who had almost unraveled the very fabric of their world's magical stability. Hermione, her face smudged with soot and her robes torn by the kinetic backlash of the hourglass distortion, moved with a frantic, scholarly grace toward the central pedestal, her fingers hovering just inches above the cooling stone as she performed a series of intricate, weaving detection charms to ensure that no residual pockets of the vein infection remained to fester in the Ministry's dark underbelly. The air still tasted of ozone and ancient dust, a bitter vintage that spoke of centuries-old secrets being forcibly unearthed and then buried once more under the weight of a superior, more compassionate will. Yet beneath that acrid scent, Harry could detect the faint, sweet aroma of the morning air filtering down through the ventilation shafts from the world above. Kingsley Shacklebolt burst into the room at the head of a phalanx of seasoned aurors, his deep purple robes billowing behind him like the wings of a predatory bird, and his golden earring glinting with a fierce, protective light that matched the intensity of his gaze as it swept over the wreckage of the chamber. He stopped short, his eyes taking in the unconscious form of Cassius, the splintered remains of the silver signet ring, and the exhausted but defiant stances of the two heroes who had once again stood in the breach when the shadows had grown too long for the rest of the world to bear. There was no need for immediate words, for the story was written in the scorched tiles and the warped dimensions of the room. Yet Kingsley's presence brought with it a sense of restored order that allowed the crushing weight of Harry's fatigue to finally begin its slow, agonizing descent upon his weary muscles. The aurors moved with practiced efficiency, their wands casting soft, neutralizing glows as they secured the perimeter and began the delicate process of stabilizing the fluctuating magical fields that Cassius had tamed with his stolen legacy, but had released in his final, desperate moment of failure. We felt the surge as far as the Wizengamot chambers, Harry, a resonance so profound that the portraits of the original ministers began to weep silver tears of terror, for they remembered the vain name even when we had allowed ourselves the luxury of forgetting it, Kingsley said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to steady the very stones of the floor. He stepped towards the pedestal, his hand resting briefly on Harry's shoulder in a gesture that was both a commendation and a silent apology for the burden that had once again been placed upon the shoulders of a man who had already given so much to the cause of peace. Hermione looked up from her diagnostic work, her eyes bright with a feverish intellectual clarity as she pointed toward the empty space where the shadow wand had once vibrated with its impossible, light-drinking hunger, her voice trembling slightly with the sheer magnitude of the discovery they had made. The wand wasn't just a weapon, Kingsley. It was a key to a subterranean network of ancient ley lines that the Vanes had mapped out during the Middle Ages, a hidden geography of power that exists beneath our modern ministry, like a second, more primal nervous system, she explained, her wand tracing a shimmering map in the air that glowed with a faint, pulsing violet light. As the realization of the true scale of the conspiracy began to sink in, Harry felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over him, understanding that the destruction of the Shadow Wand and the capture of Cassius were merely the first steps in a long, arduous process of purging the corruption that had seeped into the very foundations of their government. He watched as the Aurors levitated Cassius onto a stretcher, the man's head lolling to the side with a pathetic, slack-jawed indifference that stood in stark contrast to the arrogant, godlike persona he had projected only moments before. And Harry wondered how many other ghosts were currently walking the halls of the Ministry, waiting for their own chance to reclaim a past that was better left in the grave. The circular room, with its 12 doors now mostly closed and silent, seemed to watch them with 1,000 unseen eyes, its architecture a testament to the fact that there would always be mysteries that the human mind was not meant to fully grasp, and that the price of safety was a vigilance that never truly slept. Outside the Department of Mysteries, the elevators began to ferry the wounded and the victorious back toward the upper levels, and as Harry and Hermione stepped into the golden cage once more, they felt the familiar jarring sensation of the ascent, the floor pressing against their boots as they rose from the depths of the earth toward the light of a new, albeit complicated, day. They emerged into the atrium, which was now flooded with the brilliant, unapologetic sunshine of a London morning, the golden statues of the fountain gleaming with a renewed, untarnished splendor that seemed to mock the darkness they had just escaped. The journalists from the Daily Prophet were already beginning to gather near the security gates, their quick quotes quills hovering like expectant vultures. But Harry ignored them, his focus entirely on the sight of the blue sky visible through the enchanted windows high above, a reminder that the world was larger and more resilient than the petty ambitions of those who sought to master it. He leaned against the cold marble of a nearby pillar, closing his eyes for a moment and allowing the warmth of the sun to penetrate his chilled skin, while Hermione sat beside him on a stone bench, her head resting on his shoulder in a rare moment of shared, silent exhaustion that spoke of a bond forged in the fires of a dozen different wars. They were no longer the children who had wandered the corridors of Hogwarts with wide eyes and racing hearts, but they were still the keepers of a light that the darkness could not extinguish. And as the bustle of the Ministry began to resume its normal, frantic pace around them, they knew that their work was far from over. The Shadow Wand was gone, its essence scattered into the winds of the Forbidden Forest and the deep vaults of the Ministry, but the memory of its hunger would remain as a warning to all those who believed that power could be taken without consequence or held without a soul to anchor it. "We should go home, Harry, for Ron will be pacing the kitchen floor with a cold pot of tea and enough nervous energy to power a dozen firebolts, and I think I've seen enough of the Department of Mysteries to last me until the next century," Hermione whispered, her voice softening as the reality of their survival finally began to override the clinical detachment of the battle. Harry nodded, a slow, tired smile spreading across his face as he thought of the quiet, mundane comforts of a life lived away from the edge of the abyss. And he stood up, offering her his hand with a gesture that was as old as time itself. They walked together toward the exit, their shadows trailing behind them on the polished floor, two figures who had looked into the void and had chosen to walk back into the light, carrying with them the scars of their victory and the promise of a future that was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely their own to write. The city of London greeted them with its usual indifferent roar, the sound of red buses and rushing commuters providing a grounding, rhythmic soundtrack to their departure from the world of magic. And as they stepped out onto the pavement of Whitehall, the air felt fresh and clean, stripped of the oily residue of the Vane legacy. They did not look back at the telephone box or the grand stone facades of the government buildings, but instead turned their faces toward the sun, feeling the gentle, persistent warmth of the spring morning as it began to dissolve the last lingering traces of the winter's chill. The story of the Shadow Wand would be told in the halls of Hogwarts and the records of the Auror office for generations to come, a tale of heroism and hidden truths. But for Harry and Hermione, it was simply another chapter in a life defined by the courage to stand against the night and the wisdom to know when the battle was finally, truly, won. As they vanished into the crowd, two ordinary people in an extraordinary world, the shadows of the Ministry seemed to recede just a little further into the corners, defeated by the simple, enduring brilliance of a light that refused to fade. The transition from the frantic, adrenaline-fueled depths of the Ministry to the quiet, domestic sanctuary of Grimmauld Place was a jarring passage through the sensory veil that separated the life of a warrior from the life of a man. And as Harry stepped through the threshold of his ancestral home, the ancient floorboards groaned under his weight, as if acknowledging the heavy burden of the secrets he had just carried back from the Department of Mysteries. The air inside the house was thick with the scent of beeswax, old tapestry, and the faint, lingering aroma of Creature's onion soup, a comforting olfactory tapestry that seemed to weave itself around his battered spirit and offer a momentary respite from the metallic tang of spent magic and the cold, clinical shadows of the Vane conspiracy. Hermione followed close behind him, her movements uncharacteristically sluggish as the monumental toll of the dimensional duel began to manifest in the trembling of her hands and the dark, bruised hollows beneath her eyes. Yet she still clutched her beaded bag as though it contained the very blueprints of the wizarding world's salvation. They retreated into the drawing room, where the fire had been banked low in the grate, casting long, flickering tongues of amber light across the silver-threaded family tree that climbed the walls like a suffocating vine. A reminder that lineage was both a gift of strength and a poisonous wellspring of madness. Harry collapsed into a high-backed armchair that smelled of dust and forgotten summers, feeling the structural integrity of his resolve begin to fray at the edges, while the silence of the house pressed against his eardrums with a weight that was almost as suffocating as the vacuum of the Shadow Wand. He watched as Hermione began to pace the narrow strip of Persian rug between the hearth and the window, her mind clearly still trapped in the spinning circular room, replaying every gesture of Cassius Vane and every vibration of the atmospheric distortion in an attempt to categorize a threat that defied the logical boundaries of modern arithmancy. We cannot simply assume that the capture of Cassius is the end of this, Harry, for the Vane signet ring was not a unique artifact, but a key to a much larger, much more terrifying mechanism of control that has been dormant beneath the Ministry for centuries, waiting for a hand bold enough to turn the lock, she murmured, her voice a low, melodic thrum that seemed to harmonize with the crackling of the embers in the fireplace. She paused by the window, looking out at the darkened square of London, where the Muggles went about their lives in blissful ignorance of the metaphysical abyss that had almost opened beneath their feet. And she realized that the true danger of the Shadow Wand was not its capacity for destruction, but its ability to erase the very memory of the magic it consumed. Harry leaned his head back against the velvet cushions, his eyes tracing the intricate patterns of the ceiling molding as he contemplated the terrifying possibility that their history was a sieve, through which the most dangerous truths were constantly slipping away until they were nothing more than ghost stories told to frighten first years. The fire flared suddenly as a log shifted, sending a fountain of sparks upward into the chimney, and for a fleeting second, the light caught a small, forgotten portrait tucked behind a heavy velvet curtain, a depiction of a stern, sharp-featured woman whose eyes seemed to track Harry's every movement with a cold, ancestral disapproval. This was Melania Vane, a distant relative by marriage to the Black family, and as Harry looked at her painted face, he saw the same fanatical, predatory intelligence that had burned in the eyes of Cassius, a genetic echo of a philosophy that viewed the world as a harvest to be reaped by those of superior blood. He understood then that the battle they had fought in the Ministry was merely a single skirmish in a generational war of ideas, a conflict that would never truly be won with wands and hexes, but only through the slow, agonizing process of building a society where such shadows had no place to hide. Hermione eventually stopped her pacing and sat on the edge of the sofa, her expression softening as she looked at Harry, seeing not the chosen one or the head Auror, but the friend who had walked beside her through every darkness since they were 11 years old, and she reached out to rest her hand on his, her touch a grounding, human warmth in a room full of ghosts. The Ministry will spend months, perhaps years, auditing every vault and every resonance log, but they will never find what we found in that forest, the way the earth itself fought back against the void. And that is the only thing that gives me hope for the future, she said, her voice regaining a measure of its usual fierce clarity. They sat in the deepening twilight of the room, two veterans of a war that had transitioned from the battlefield to the bureaucracy, knowing that the morning would bring a fresh onslaught of questions, reports, and political maneuverings that would require every ounce of their remaining strength. As the clock on the mantelpiece chimed the midnight hour with a slow, mournful resonance, Harry felt the last of the adrenaline evaporate, leaving behind a profound, aching hollowness that was not the hunger of the wand, but the exhaustion of a soul that had seen too many shadows for one lifetime. He thought of Ginny, who was away with the Harpies, and would be returning in 2 days to a husband who smelled of ozone and ancient secrets, and he wondered how many more times he would have to pull himself out of the abyss before the light finally decided to stay. He stood up, his joints popping with a sound like dry twigs breaking in the forest, and offered his hand to Hermione to help her rise from the depths of the sofa, their silent agreement to seek the mercy of sleep being the most honest spell they had cast all night. They walked up the creaking staircase together, the shadows of the banisters stretching out like the fingers of a giant across the peeling wallpaper, while the house itself seemed to breathe in a slow, rhythmic pulse that matched the beating of their own hearts. At the landing, they parted ways with a weary, affectionate nod, each retreating into their respective rooms, where the blankets and pillows offered a temporary sanctuary from the complexities of a world that refused to remain at peace. Harry lay in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of the city outside, the distant siren of an ambulance, the hum of a passing car, the rustle of the wind in the trees of the square, and he realized that the ordinary world was the greatest enchantment of all, a miracle of small, mundane moments that the shadow wand could never truly understand or consume. He closed his eyes, and instead of the violet fire of the ritual chamber or the smoke mask of the golem, he saw the green canopy of the forest in the height of summer. The sun filtering through the leaves in shafts of liquid gold that danced upon the moss and the ferns. He saw a world where the trees were not weapons, and the earth was not a source of stolen power, but a living, breathing entity that held the memories of the past in the silent embrace of its roots, ensuring that even when the wizards forgot, the land would always remember. In that vision of a quiet, unblemished peace, Harry Potter finally drifted into a deep, dreamless slumber, while below him, in the heart of the house, the silver family tree continued to shimmer in the dying firelight, a testament to the shadows that had been defeated, and the light that would always return to claim the dawn. The story of the Shadow Wand was a reminder that the greatest threats were often those that grew from our own forgotten history, and that the only true defense against the void was a heart that was full of the light of friendship, courage, and the stubborn, unyielding belief in the goodness of the world. As the moon reached its zenith over London, casting a silver pallor over the rooftops and the river, the ministry remained silent, the Department of Mysteries remained locked, and the boy who had lived rested in the knowledge that for one more night, the darkness had been held at bay. The future remained an unwritten scroll, full of potential and peril, but as long as there were those willing to stand in the shadows and hold the torch high, the light would never truly vanish from the magical world, and the legends of the Peverils would remain where they belonged, in the dusty, harmless pages of the past. The morning light that filtered through the grime-streaked windows of Grimold Place did not arrive with the triumphant clarity of a new era, but rather with a pale, hesitant gray that seemed to reflect the lingering uncertainty of a world that had narrowly avoided a metaphysical collapse. Harry awoke not to the singing of birds or the bustle of London, but to the rhythmic, heavy thudding of a ministry owl against the glass, its amber eyes wide with the urgency of a message that could not wait for the comforts of a slow awakening or a warm cup of tea. He dragged himself from the tangled sheets, his muscles screaming with the memory of the kinetic shockwaves from the Department of Mysteries, and as he unfurled the thick, cream-colored parchment, he saw the emerald ink of Kingsley Shacklebolt's handwriting, which appeared hurried and sharp, as if the minister himself had not found sleep in the intervening hours. The letter spoke of a secondary tremor within the ley lines, a localized disturbance centered not in the ministry or the Forbidden Forest, but in the forgotten, subterranean ruins of an ancient Vane manor located deep beneath the salt marshes of Essex, where the boundaries between the land and the sea were as fluid as the magic Cassius had tried to command. Harry stood in the center of his bedroom, the cold floorboards leaching the warmth from his feet, while he contemplated the reality that the shadow of the wand had a longer reach than they had initially dared to imagine, extending its dark fingers into the very bedrock of the British Isles. He dressed with a mechanical precision, strapping his holly wand to his arm and donning a heavy, enchanted traveling cloak that had seen more battles than many wizards saw in a lifetime. All while the silence of the house seemed to amplify the frantic beating of his own heart. Hermione was already waiting for him in the kitchen, her hair a wild, crackling halo of static energy, and her table covered in ancient maps that depicted the shifting coastlines of the medieval era, her finger tracing a jagged path toward a point on the map that glowed with a faint, sickly violet light. She did not need to ask if he had received the message, for the same grim determination was etched into the lines of her face, a silent testament to the fact that their journey into the heart of the Vane legacy was far from its final, conclusive chapter. The resonance we felt in the ritual chamber was merely a sympathetic vibration, Harry, "for the true anchor of the Shadow Wand's power is not a piece of wood or a silver ring, but a living node of entropic energy that the veins have been nurturing for 10 generations beneath the salt and the silt," she explained, her voice carrying a sharp, academic edge that barely concealed the underlying current of visceral dread that had taken hold of her since the previous night. They did not linger for breakfast, instead opting to disapparate directly from the doorstep of number 12, the world twisting into a suffocating, lightless squeeze before exploding outward into the desolate, wind-swept expanse of the Essex marshes. The air here was thick with the scent of brine, decaying vegetation, and a metallic tang that signaled the presence of a massive, concentrated magical field that distorted the horizon and made the very clouds appear to coil like serpents above the gray, churning waters. They began the treacherous trek across the mudflats, their boots sinking into the sulphurous mire while the wind howled through the skeletal remains of dead trees that stood like sentinels guarding the entrance to a world that time had sought to bury and forget. Every step toward the center of the disturbance felt like walking against a physical tide of negation, a pressure that sought to unweave the spells of their cloaks and dampen the natural brilliance of their internal magic until they were nothing more than flickering shadows in a landscape of absolute gray. As they reached a low, crumbling stone archway that was half submerged in the rising tide, Harry felt his scar prickle with a cold, familiar warning, a sensation that had not bothered him since the final defeat of Voldemort, but which now flared with a renewed, predatory intensity that suggested the presence of an older, more primal darkness. He raised his wand, the tip glowing with a fierce, defiant white light that struggled to penetrate the gathering gloom, and he saw that the stones of the archway were carved with the same broken hourglass and coiled manticore that had graced the signet ring of Cassius Vane. "This is not a ruin, Hermione. It's a laboratory of the soul, a place where the Vanes attempted to achieve immortality not through the preservation of life, but through the mastery of the void itself," Harry whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the incoming sea and the dissonant humming that began to rise from the depths of the earth. They descended a flight of slippery, barnacle-encrusted stairs that led into a cavernous, subterranean hall where the walls were lined with thousands of glass jars, each containing a flickering, captive spark of magic that had been harvested from the world above over the course of centuries. At the far end of the hall, suspended over a pit of churning, iridescent mercury, hung a massive crystalline structure that resembled a heart, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic violet light that seemed to draw the very warmth from the room and replace it with a killing chill. This was the true shadow, the source of the wand's hunger and the ultimate goal of the Vane conspiracy, a machine of pure negation that was designed to act as a black hole within the magical ecosystem, consuming the light of the world to fuel the ascension of its creators. As they approached the crystal heart, the shadows on the walls began to detach themselves from the stone, taking the form of the Vane ancestors who had died long ago, but whose fragmented consciousnesses had been preserved within the lattice of the machine, their transparent faces twisted into expressions of eternal, unquenchable greed. Harry realized that they were not just fighting a man or a wand, but a collective, historical momentum that sought to return the world to a state of primordial chaos, where only the strongest and most ruthless could survive the coming of the night. Hermione began to chant a series of complex, stabilizing incantations that were designed to create a localized field of order around the crystal, her wand moving in patterns so intricate that they left trails of golden fire in the stagnant air. But the machine reacted with a violent, concussive burst of negative energy that sent her reeling back against the shelves of captive sparks. Harry lunged forward, his holly wand vibrating so intensely that he feared it might shatter in his grip, and he channeled every ounce of his courage and his love into a single, focused stream of pure, white light that struck the crystal heart at its very center. The impact was not a sound, but a metaphysical scream that echoed through the halls of the manor and out across the marshes, a collision of two diametrically opposed realities that threatened to tear the very foundations of the earth asunder. The crystal began to crack, the violet light leaking out in jagged, uncontrolled flashes that ignited the mercury pit and sent plumes of toxic, multicolored smoke billowing toward the ceiling, while the shadows of the Vane ancestors dissolved into nothingness, their long-delayed deaths finally arriving in a spectacle of silent, agonizing erasure. The light of 1,000 years against the hunger of the void, Harry. Hold the connection, for if the heart shatters before the energy is neutralized, it will take the entire coastline with it. Hermione shouted, her voice cutting through the roar of the collapsing laboratory as she struggled to her feet and joined her magic to his, their combined power forming a golden spear that pierced the darkness and began to systematically dismantle the crystalline lattice. The room began to shake as the stabilizing charms of the manor failed, the salt water of the rising tide beginning to pour through the cracks in the ceiling. Yet Harry did not waver, his eyes fixed on the pulsating core of the machine until the violet light finally began to fade into a dull, harmless gray. With a final, explosive release of energy, the crystal heart disintegrated into a fine, sparkling dust that was instantly swept away by the incoming sea, and the oppressive, killing chill that had dominated the hall was replaced by the cold, honest spray of the Atlantic Ocean. They scrambled back up the crumbling stairs just as the subterranean hall collapsed into the mercury pit, the weight of the salt marshes reclaiming the secrets of the House of Vane and burying them forever beneath the shifting sands and the relentless tides. As they stood on the shore, gasping for air and watching the whirlpools mark the site of the manor's final destruction, the sun finally broke through the coiling clouds, casting a brilliant, redeeming light across the water that turned the foam of the waves into a shimmering field of diamonds. Harry looked at his wand, seeing that the wood was scorched and the tip was slightly blunted, but it still hummed with a quiet, resilient life that echoed the beating of his own heart, a reminder that the world was still full of magic that was meant to be shared rather than consumed. Hermione leaned against him, her exhaustion so profound that she could barely keep her eyes open, but a small, triumphant smile played across her lips as she watched the last of the violet shadows dissipate into the morning sky. The conspiracy of the Shadow Wand was finally over, its tools destroyed, and its architects banished to the annals of a history that would no longer be written in the blood of the innocent. Yet the memory of the struggle would remain as a cornerstone of the world they would continue to build. They turned away from the marshes, leaving the gray, desolate landscape behind as they prepared to return to the warmth and the light of their own lives, knowing that while the shadows would always exist, they would never again be strong enough to extinguish the flame of a courage that was born of friendship and tempered in the fires of the void. As they vanished from the shore with a final, echoing crack, the wind carried away the last traces of the Vane legacy, leaving only the sound of the sea and the cry of the gulls to mark the place where the darkness had finally met its match. The final echoes of the crystalline heart's destruction rippled across the surface of the Essex marshes like the dying gasps of a leviathan, and as the salt-heavy air began to settle into a fragile, crystalline stillness, Harry and Hermione stood upon the shivering mudflats, their silhouettes cast long and thin by a sun that seemed to burn with a newfound fierce intensity. The collapse of the Vane Manor beneath the weight of the sea was not merely a physical subsidence, but a metaphysical closing of a wound that had festered in the shadows of Britain for 1,000 years. Yet the silence that followed was so profound that Harry could hear the very blood singing in his ears, a rhythmic reminder of the life that had so nearly been extinguished by the cold breath of the void. He looked down at his hands, which were stained with the silver residue of the mercury pit and the blackened soot of the shadow fire, and he realized with a start that the tremors that had plagued his grip since the Department of Mysteries had finally ceased, replaced by a steady, unwavering strength that felt as ancient and unyielding as the granite of the Highlands. Hermione, her robes drenched in brine and her breathing coming in long, shuddering drafts of the ocean air, leaned against a weathered gallows tree that had survived the magical gale. Her eyes fixed upon the churning whirlpool where the secrets of the true shadow had been swallowed by the relentless, cleansing tide. She did not speak for a long time, for the sheer scale of the historical erasure they had witnessed was too vast to be captured in the clumsy nets of human language. Yet the small, triumphant smile that tugged at the corners of her mouth spoke of a scholarly soul that had seen the impossible and had lived to document its downfall. The atmosphere of the marshes, which had been thick with the suffocating pressure of negation only an hour before, now felt light and expansive, as if the very atoms of the air had been liberated from a heavy, invisible chain that had sought to pull them into the abyss of the Vane legacy. "It is gone, Harry. Not just the machine and the laboratory, but the very resonance of the Vane ambition has been washed clean from the ley lines of the coast, leaving behind a void that the natural magic of the earth will soon fill with the scent of pine and the song of the rising tide," she finally whispered, her voice carrying a melodic resonance that seemed to harmonize with the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the shore. They began the long, slow walk back toward the firm ground of the cliffs, their boots churning the gray silt into patterns that the next tide would erase forever, while far above, a parliament of owls began to circle the site of the battle, their cries no longer frantic warnings but mournful elegies for a darkness that had forgotten its place in the world. Harry felt the weight of his holly wand against his forearm, its wood no longer vibrating with the dissonant hunger of the shadow wand, but pulsing with a warm, sympathetic glow that signaled its return to a state of equilibrium with the natural forces of the universe. As they crested the final ridge and looked back at the vast, shimmering expanse of the Atlantic, they saw a fleet of ministry broomsticks appearing on the horizon like a swarm of dragonflies, their silver streaks marking the arrival of the reinforcements that Kingsley Shacklebolt had promised to send once the secondary tremor had been localized. The Aurors landed with a coordinated, tactical grace, their colorful robes creating a vibrant contrast against the monochromatic desolation of the marshes. And as they fanned out to begin the task of securing the perimeter and cataloging the environmental damage, Harry felt a sudden, overwhelming desire to be away from the reports, the questions, and the clinical scrutiny of the magical government. He shared a look with Hermione, a silent communication forged in the fires of 100 different crises, and they both knew that the true resolution of the Shadow Wand was not to be found in the archives of the Ministry, but in the quiet, unrecorded moments of a life lived in the light of day. They waited just long enough to brief the lead investigator, a stern-faced wizard named Proudfoot, who looked at the ruins with a mixture of professional curiosity and ancestral dread, before stepping beyond the line of the security wards and preparing for the final, exhausting journey back to the heart of London. The world twisted into the familiar, suffocating spiral of apparition, and when they reappeared in the quiet, sun-drenched square of Grimmauld Place, The sounds of the city felt like a beautiful, chaotic symphony that celebrated the mundane miracle of a Wednesday afternoon. The house of number 12 seemed to have shed some of its gloomy ancestral weight in their absence, its windows sparkling in the afternoon light, and its door standing open to welcome home the weary travelers who had defended its honor in the lightless corners of the world. Inside, the smell of fresh tea and the crackling of a new fire greeted them, for Creature had sensed their victory through the subtle shifts in the house's internal enchantments, and had prepared a sanctuary that was as far removed from the cold halls of the Vane Manor as it was possible to be. Harry collapsed into the armchair by the hearth, watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of sunlight that slanted across the floorboards, and he realized that the greatest magic he had ever wielded was not the white fire of the Patronus or the golden spear of the ley lines, but the simple, enduring courage to protect the people and the places that made the world worth living in. Hermione sat opposite him, her hair finally beginning to settle, and her eyes losing the feverish brilliance of the battle, and she reached out to pour him a cup of tea with a steady hand that spoke of a peace that had been hard won and was now fiercely guarded. "We shall have to write a report, eventually, for Kingsley will want a detailed account of the true shadow and the mechanism of the crystal heart. But for today, let the Ministry believe that the sea simply claimed its own, and that the House of Vane has finally found the silence it so richly deserved," she said, her voice softening as the warmth of the fire began to seep into her chilled bones. Harry nodded, his mind drifting toward the future. A future where the name Harry Potter would not be synonymous with war and sacrifice, but with the quiet, steady vigilance of a man who knew that the shadows would always exist, but would never again be allowed to rule the dawn. He thought of the Forbidden Forest, where the ancient oak would be unfurling its new leaves in the Scottish spring, and he thought of the Department of Mysteries, where the vaults would be locked and the secrets would be kept by those who understood that some mysteries were better left unsolved. The story of the Shadow Wand was a reminder that even the most powerful artifacts were nothing more than wood and stone without a soul to guide them, and that the true power of the wizarding world lay not in the mastery of the void, but in the connections between the living and the legacies of love that survived even the longest night. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the drawing room, Harry Potter finally closed his eyes, not in the defensive posture of a warrior waiting for the next blow, but in the peaceful surrender of a hero who had seen the darkness defeated and the light restored to its rightful place in the sky. The silver family tree on the wall remained silent, its leaves no longer shivering with the hunger of the veins, and as the clock on the mantelpiece ticked away the seconds of a quiet, ordinary life, the boy who had lived rested in the knowledge that for now, and perhaps for a long time to come, the world was safe in the hands of those who chose to walk in the sun. The legends of the Peverils and the ambitious dreams of the pure-blood lineages would continue to haunt the dusty corners of libraries and the whispered conversations of the ambitious. But they would find no purchase in a world that had seen the strength of a simple, honest courage and the brilliance of a friendship that could not be broken by the void. Harry's breathing became slow and rhythmic, a mirror of the sea's pulse, but without its killing chill, and as he drifted into a deep, dreamless slumber, the House of Grimmauld Place stood as a beacon of warmth in the heart of London. A testament to the fact that even the oldest shadows must eventually yield to the coming of the light. The final chapter of the Shadow Wand was not written in ink or blood, but in the silence of a battle won, and the peace of a morning that promised nothing more and nothing less than the beauty of the everyday world. The sun eventually dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of violet and gold that recalled the colors of the battle but held none of its terror. And as the stars began to emerge one by one over the dreaming city, the magical world continued its slow, graceful rotation toward a future that was entirely its own. There would be other mysteries, and there would be other shadows, for such is the nature of a world built on magic and mystery. But for Harry Potter and Hermione Granger, the journey had reached its summit, and the view from the top was one of a quiet, unblemished peace that would last until the end of their days. In the stillness of the night, the memory of the shadow wand became a mere whisper in the wind, a story told to remind the young that the light is always stronger than the dark, and that as long as there are those who remember the power of a single, brave heart, the void will never truly win.
Часто думаю, що б зробив я на місці нашого героя, коли все життя вчило тебе діяти певним чином, коли твоя сила завжди була твоєю перевагою, а потім раптом настає якась мить, коли саме ця сила починає працювати проти тебе. Чесно кажучи, це дуже якийсь непростий вибір. Бо іноді найбільша мудрість полягає не в тому, щоб натиснути сильніше, боротися завзятіше чи говорити голосніше. Іноді потрібно зупинитися і визнати, що старий спосіб більше не працює. Гаррі переміг не тоді, коли використав наймогутніше закляття. Він переміг тоді, коли зрозумів природу загрози і відмовився грати за її правилами. Здається, що в реальному житті це трапляється частіше навіть, ніж ми думаємо. Деякі проблеми не долаються силою, деякі конфлікти не виграються суперечками, деякі страхи зникають лише тоді, коли ми перестаємо їх годувати своєю увагою. Тож, можливо, справжня сила – це не завжди вміння боротися. Іноді справжня сила – це вміння розуміти, коли настав час обрати інший шлях. І саме тоді там темрява втрачає свою владу. Тому боремось проти темряви, стараємося, щоб вона не мала владу над нами. Ну що, дякую всім за увагу. З вами був Саламандр. До наступних зустрічей.